Thanks for being that little bit curious about Vladimir Putin. It's okay. You don't need to be afraid. It's a good thing that you're curious. After all, if we find out a little bit about Vladimir Putin, we might make the world a little bit safer. You see, the Western world has got itself into a trap. It has so demonized Vladimir Putin and the country of Russia and Russians that it cannot hear what he and they are saying. But Russia is an important country, and Vladimir Putin has been a world leader since 1999. We really ought to understand his point of view, right? And in October 2022, Vladimir Putin, President of Russia, gave a very important speech that both helps us understand his point of view and the nature of the changing world order, the emergence of the multipolar world over the next decade. You have probably heard next to nothing about it in the mainstream media. If you have, it's probably something about Putin having a 3-hour rambling speech or 4-hour rambling speech. So let me summarize it for you and show you why it matters to your life and how it can help us all live with more confidence and peace and prosperity in this multipolar world. Now, I'm Jeff Rich, and this is the Burning Archive, a YouTube channel. I am a author and a recently retired government official, and I also have a podcast, the Burning Archive podcast, an audio podcast, some of the episodes of which are on my YouTube channel, but which you can also listen to via Apple, Spotify, or whatever podcast platform you have. And you can also check me out on Substack and at my website, theburningarchive.com. Let's talk about Vladimir Putin's speech. Now, he gave this speech at a very important conference that's held in Russia every year, the Valdai discussion club meeting. And it's sort of traditional. The Valdai Club is like a bit like the Davos World Economic Forum event, but with Russia, it tends to gather together sort of a more sort of intellectual type of people rather than business leaders, but there is some element of that as well. Leading the think tanks, journalists, commentators, foreign policy experts in particular, and it invites people from kind of around the world. And it's sort of been traditional over a number of years for Putin to give the sort of final plenary speech and like a Q&A session at the end of the conference. And he commonly addresses pretty high-level, conceptual foreign policy themes. And this is reflected in the nature of this year's conference, which was all about the multipolar world after the decline of a global hegemon, unnamed, but of course the United States. And you can you don't have to rely on the mainstream media to find out about this. You can go directly to the Kremlin website where I am here, and there is the full speech, both audio recording with English, voiced over translation, as well as both a full script in Russian and in English. If you read Russian, just read the Russian, but you can also read the full authorized translation from the Kremlin itself. And it has the video. Also, his speech is available on a couple of YouTube sites as well. The Valdai Discussion Club itself used to have a YouTube, well, still has a YouTube channel, but it's been blocked in the midst of the current NATO-Russian war. Putin's speech is about, 40, 50 minutes long. And then there's a 3-hour question and answer session, really quite a marathon. And just imagine if you are a bit skeptical or fearful of Vladimir Putin, ask yourself this question for a start. Aren't you curious about a political leader, a world leader who can give a 40-minute speech and then hold an entire press conference across an enormous range of topics for 3 or 4 hours, and not with journalists so much asking questions as leading intellectual figures from a number of different countries? So I don't see Joe Biden doing that anytime soon. So don't let the wartime censorship in the West stop you from getting information about this. It's really well worth the time. But what I'm going to do now is really sort of talk you through the speech itself. And I should say I'm a retired government official now. I've worked in one of the governments in Australia for over 30 years and have written quite a few speeches for political leaders over the journey. And so I guess in summarising the speech, I'm trying to draw out both what he's actually saying, but also give you maybe whatever insight I can offer as someone with that kind of experience and that kind of perspective, someone who's actually himself crafted major political speeches of one kind or another. Policy sort of speeches. And this one is not like a tub-thumping political rant. It's not a rambling speech. It's actually a quite intelligent, thoughtful speech, full of historical and cultural references. And after you've watched this video, you might want to check out my other video that is actually looking at 7 of the key cultural historical references in Vladimir Putin's Valdai speech. The link is below, all on the YouTube channel there. And I should also say, of course, that I'm presenting his argument here. I'm not endorsing it, and nor am I just instantly dismissing it. I'm simply saying that we should respect and understand it without the usual sort of screams of prejudice about Vladimir Putin being a killer and a dictator and a madman and etc., etc. So I'm going to run through the speech. So he opens the speech with a discussion of the system-wide global crisis in which the West finds itself, in which the world finds itself, and in which Putin really says that the West is overreaching to maintain its role of leader of the world, its global hegemonic status. Even though the West is in many ways weak, divided, and has a key idea which large parts of the world do not accept as legitimate, which is the idea of the rules-based international order. And them might sound like fighting words, but he almost immediately also indicates that he is actually open to diplomacy and being quite pragmatic about the resolution of these issues. He says sooner or later both the new centres of the multipolar international order and the West will have to start a dialogue on an equal footing about a common future for us all. Then he turns, perhaps surprisingly, to the environment and diversity, and the threat to biospecies diversity. And the talking about the environment is sort of, I guess, shifting the perception of who Vladimir Putin and Russia is, because he's saying they're concerned about the environment too, and climate change, etc., and this world crisis that we've found ourselves in with the Ukraine war is threatening reasonable action on species, environmental protection, as well as climate change. But this is a little bit of a rhetorical trick, because it gets the audience on side. And then what he really is, the point he's really making there, is that just as diversity is an important value to preserve in relationship to the environment, so too it is important to have cultural, social, political, and what he calls civilizational diversity. In a way, it's a direct challenge to the idea of the world converging around one model, the Western model, and having a uniform approach to globalization. And he sees this as really cramping the creative potential of other countries, other cultures, other civilizations, and reflects a desire to constrain those countries like China, like Russia, like Southeast Asia, like India, like Africa, like South America, to meet the needs of what he describes as the mercantile interest of the Western elite. And underlying all of this, Putin says, is a liberal neo-colonial ideology of the West, which it finds its most extreme form in cancel culture, which he describes as a variation of book burning. Now, the Western model of globalization is neo-colonial in Putin's perspective, and aims to erase differences and enforce standardization and technological and financial monopoly. Western banks, Western IT, Western technical standards, Western control wherever you look. Its ideological form, he says, is the advocacy of the so-called liberal model of democracy, which Putin argues has been advocated and forced on countries through colour revolutions and coups, including the events in Ukraine in 2014. And that's a controversial topic, which probably deserves a video all of its own. But let's just, for now, take Putin's understanding of those events as read so we can understand his point of view. But he argues this liberal model of democracy, this international rules-based order, doesn't bring peace and prosperity for the world. It brings chaos and despair for much of the world. But the world, he says, is now starting to demand real democracy in international affairs. And in doing so, he contrasts Russia's tradition of accepting religious and cultural pluralism and diversity, like Russia's long had multiple faiths and multiple ethnic groups, has long been, and under the Soviet Union was a federation of many different countries, and draws a sharp contrast with the sort of ethnic nationalism that has been quite strong in Ukraine. But he also comments that the current huge crisis in the world around Ukraine is a system crisis of the world order. He says, and here I quote, "It is a doctrinal crisis of the neoliberal American-style model of international order. They, as in America, have no ideas for progress and positive development. They simply have nothing to offer the world except perpetuating their dominance." So real democracy in a multipolar world, Putin argues, must mean any society or civilization can follow its own path and organise its own socio-political system. But with those civilizations not clashing, but rather relying, and here again a quote, "relying on a dialogue between civilizations and spiritual and moral values. Indeed, understanding what humans and their nature are all about varies across civilizations, but this difference is often superficial, and everyone recognizes the ultimate dignity and spiritual essence of people, a common foundation on which we can and must build our future is crucially important." And here he is also making an argument for handling with care, is the term he uses, and respecting the many varied traditions across the world, rather than getting all those traditions to conform with the Western liberal model of democracy, largely secular democracy, or at least white Anglo-Saxon Protestant democracy. He comments on the complicated processes, political and social, taking place in Western countries, but he hopes for a pragmatic, and here again, let's quote and hear the words directly. This is not the words of a madman or a warmonger. He hopes for a pragmatic dialogue with the genuine traditional West, as well as with other co-equal development centres, and that this will become a major contribution to the construction of a multipolar world order. The multipolar world order has been a key theme of Vladimir Putin's speeches since at least 2008, and of Russian foreign policy very much since that time. So there is a note of hope, he argues, in the realistic acceptance of the diversity of the world. And he also comments how countries around the world are increasingly turning against the restriction of that diversity by America and its liberal rules-based order. More and more national leaders are rejecting these attempts to impose order. And he says, Putin says, "I am convinced that the nations of the world will not shut their eyes to a policy of coercion that has discredited itself. Every time the West will have to pay a higher price for its attempts to preserve its hegemony. If I were a Western elite, I would seriously ponder this prospect." And of course, we're hearing word, for example, that Saudi Arabia may choose to join the BRICS and agree to change its arrangement underpinning the American petrodollar, so that perhaps it might even be exactly that example that Vladimir Putin has in mind, because that could threaten America's reserve currency status. So Putin by no means is condemning the West as a whole. He is by no means expressing a kind of, hatred of a group of people. He's very much targeting his concerns at the Western elites, and he hopes for respectful dialogue with many of the traditions of the West, but cannot see that happening with what he describes as the aggressive, cosmopolitan and neo-colonial tool of neoliberal elites. He talks about facing down that exact kind of ideology in dealing with extremists supported by Western governments in Chechnya, and expresses some regret that all his attempts to work cooperatively with the West were rejected, and the West simply would not live and let live with Russia forging its own fate. And here he refers to a Russian philosopher or historian, ethnologist of the 19th century, Nikolai Danilevsky. And do check out my video about the historical and cultural references in Putin's Valdai speech, where I'll say a little bit more about Danilevsky. But in the speech, Putin says that Danilevsky advocates the free development of countries and peoples, not single models, but the flourishing complexity of culture and tradition. This principle, he says, should underpin the emerging multipolar world. And if it does so, then that new world will be based on law and right and free, distinctive and fair. He also argues this should have or comments then that this will need to take a very practical form in the form of global financial infrastructure and scientific technological exchange, and refers to Russia's attempts to develop multilateral institutions to support those endeavours, despite the sanctions applied to Russia. He comments that he does not advocate autarky, like the idea of a society or economy sort of being self-sufficient all by itself, even though many people make that claim about Russia, but that he is pursuing a model of energetic and mutually beneficial cooperation based on fairness and equality. He's looking for integration of multiple cultures rather than dictates from one. And this is also illustrated in the initiatives Russia has supported along with China and other countries in the Eurasian space. And here he comments that in this regard, Russia believes it is important to make wider use of mechanisms for creating large spaces that rely on interaction between neighbouring countries, whose economies and social systems, as well as resources, bases and infrastructure, complement each other. In fact, these large spaces are what some people call Eurasia, some people call it a world island, often a target of geopolitical strategists from the West. These large spaces form the economic basis of a multipolar world order. Their dialogue gives rise to genuine unity in humanity, which is much more complex, unique and multi-dimensional than the simplistic ideas professed by some Western masterminds. Who those Western masterminds are, I have a stab at guessing in my video, my other video on the cultural references of Putin's speech. Now, the West is one small strand in Eurasia, he comments, and it can develop Eurasia, it is, can develop a sort of self-sufficient complex possessing huge resources and opportunities for institutions like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the One Belt One Road Initiative, the North-South Transport Corridor, and other multilateral projects. And then he turns to what, referring to Alexander Solzhenitsyn, he describes as the blindness of supremacy in Europe and the Atlantic world. Europe, he says, quotes, I quote, Europe, the western extremity of the greater Eurasia, could also become its natural part, but many of its leaders are hampered by the conviction that the Europeans are superior to others, that it is beneath them to take part as equals in undertakings with others. This arrogance prevents them from seeing that they have themselves become a foreign periphery and actually turned into vassals, often without the right to vote. And here, of course, he is referring to the comments from the European Union's sort of foreign minister, Joseph Borrell, that Europe is a garden and the rest of the world is a jungle. And the common view, I guess, that Europe has ceded through NATO and its agreement to the American sanctioned economic war against Russia to a policy that's done enormous harm to the economy and the citizens of Europe, but supported the interests of the American elite. The era of Western domination is ending, Vladimir Putin says. So here we are entering the most dangerous, unpredictable and important decade since 1945. And his comment that it's a potentially dangerous decade has certainly been picked up a little bit in the media without all that other context. So if you'd heard that phrase and you've actually now, having watched this video, seen the whole discussion of Putin's ideas in a greater context, that's what he means. This is the transition from one, I guess, global international system to another, a major change and a major potential conflict between great states or empires. The West cannot rule this world single-handedly, Putin says. Instead, what we need is acceptance of that diversity of political, social, cultural systems, that acceptance of the plurality of viable and flourishing civilizations around the world, and that those civilizations, rather than being in an eternal struggle for supremacy, should work together and form what he describes as a symphony of civilizations. And that's how he closes the speech. And that phrase, symphony of civilizations, is another of the cultural references in this, or historical references in Vladimir Putin's Valdai speech, which I address in my next video on the cultural references in Putin's Valdai speech. And there's also another one coming up soon where I talk about the reaction of the multipolar world as represented in the Q&A session of that 4-hour discussion. So I hope you, if you found this valuable, do like and subscribe to the channel. There'll be more from me soon across a range of topics to do with geopolitics, history and culture, and trying to tell the more tell meaningful stories about our multipolar world. Okay, do check those out, and thanks for watching.